It's being called apocalyptic. India is suffering unprecedented levels of air pollution, with warnings of dire consequences for people's health. But what exactly is causing pollution there and across the region? And what's being done to tackle it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Darren, Jordon. India's top court says New Delhi's choking every year and blames the state government for failing to curb pollution. The problem is so bad, schools have been shut, flights diverted and a public health emergency declared. Some experts say breathing the city's air is as bad as smoking 50 cigarettes a day. And that's not just in the capital. The World Health Organization says 13 other Indian cities are among the world's 15 most polluted. Anchal Vora reports now from New Delhi.
This brown haze has enveloped New Delhi. Anything above 400 on the city's air quality index is considered very severe. It rose about 1,000, hazardous for millions of people. It is bad every winter, but this is the first time the government has declared a public health emergency. Mr. Shatri says he doesn't like wearing a mask while driving his scooter, but it's necessary.
The reason I'm wearing a mask is increased pollution. I don't have any illness, but I cough all night. In the last 4 to 5 days, my nose is watering and my eyes are burning.
Children and the elderly are especially at risk. Rasya says she suffers a heart condition and the pollution has forced her to go to hospital.
I have a cold, a cough, and my chest hurts since pollution increased. Everything hurts now.
Doctors say because of the toxic smog, they have treated 5 times the usual number of patients over the past few days. Some people living in India's national capital say it's become a gas chamber. The state government is alternating the days cars can be driven on the roads between those whose registrations end in odd number registrations and those with even. But farmers are also being blamed.
Behind me is the iconic Rashtrapati Bhavan or President's House. It's a tall, massive building. But today, one can barely see it. The government has taken this step to halve the number of personal vehicles on the street. That should reduce air pollution a little. But as long as farmers keep burning stubble in neighbouring states, the air pollution is expected to continue to be very severe in New Delhi.
These farmers in the adjoining states of Punjab and Haryana have harvested their rice and now need to clear their land for their winter wheat crop. Burning is the quickest way. Environmentalists say that needs to change.
But I think at the end of the day, farmers need to sort of put pressure on the government to ultimately provide the right markets that are needed to shift away to other crops.
But farmers say if they are to change their practices and invest in cleaner technology and machinery, they need support from the government. That's on top of it tackling other sources of pollution, meaning those hoping for cleaner air are unlikely to have immediate relief. Anchal Vora, Al Jazeera, New Delhi.
Well, joining me now are our guests in New Delhi. Karthik Ganesan, a research fellow at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. On Skype from Helsinki, Laurie Merlivita, lead analyst on Asia at the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air. And in Bangkok, Faisal Parish, director of the Global Environment Centre. He's a specialist on fire and haze prevention. That's a problem that Malaysia faces every year. A warm welcome to you all. Karthik Ganesan in New Delhi. Let me start with you, if I may, because that's the ground zero of this problem. I mean, the air quality in New Delhi is now being described as apocalyptic. I mean, why has the situation become so dangerous and how big is the scale of the problem, briefly?
Right. So the good part is we've actually gone past apocalypse and it's actually improved in some sense today. And thanks largely to the fact that the meteorology is sort of played in favorably. And if you look at the situation that's currently there, it's there for primarily 2 reasons. One is that I think the meteorology over the last 2 or 3 days has been really unfavorable. That is like a big part of it. But more importantly, I think we anticipated that the emissions that actually are attributable to crop burning right now would not reach the proportions that they have. and the fact that, it would not combine so lethally with the meteorology. And unfortunately, activity in the streets of Delhi goes on as it would otherwise. And people don't really have a sense of the fact that, it is really lethal to breathe the air in. That's the most tragic part, really. So lack of preparedness, even though sort of odd and even was declared even a month ago, right, with regard to sort of emissions from other sources, open waste burning, or even if it's sort of ensuring that all the vehicles that are plying on the road have their emission certificates in place, or regulating industrial emissions, right? All of that, I think, was not as tight as it should have been. And then suddenly when it struck, we were left with really no options.
Let's bring in Lori Merlevita there in Helsinki. I mean, Lori, governments and their policies can't really depend on meteorology, can they? I mean, you're an expert on air pollution across Asia. Why has India got it so wrong? And what's behind this latest air pollution crisis, do you think?
Absolutely, we can't depend on the weather. Or what we can depend on is that every winter India gets this weather where you have this slow-moving air mass moving across the North India plain, collecting pollution from industries, power plants, households, crop burning, and there will be hazardous smog unless you address those emissions. If you look at the challenges that the Indian government has had in implementing its policies, one of the most depressing examples is the regulation of emissions from power plants that were supposed to already comply with new emission standards before this winter. But the government and the power firms have been dragging their feet and also diluting some of the standards. The reason that I bring this up is that with power plants, you're dealing with a few dozen sources, whereas with farmers or households, you're dealing with millions. So this should be one of the easiest places to start. But there are, of course, trade-offs, and there is opposition from those people who have to foot the bill for these measures.
Faisal Parish there in Bangkok. Faisal, I mean, how critical is the issue of vehicle emissions here? Because India may not have the strict vehicle emissions standards we see in North America and Europe. So do you think car rationing will solve the problem? I mean, we're talking about New Delhi having something like 10 million cars. I mean, that's very hard to police, isn't it?
It's difficult, and that's why I think the government is looking at this alternate days, trying to reduce the numbers. But it is a challenge, and it's difficult to police that in such a dense city as New Delhi.
Karthik Ganesan, back there in New Delhi, I mean, how much do you think India's rapid economic growth under Prime Minister Narendra Modi may have been a contributing factor to this pollution crisis? And is the environmental impact an inevitable consequence of economic growth and trying to pull millions of people out of poverty?
Right. I think it's a good question. Of course, it is undeniable that Delhi sits in a place which is susceptible to air pollution in the winters every year. But as you rightly said, in the last decade or so, these issues, of course, become very prominent. Delhi was one of the first cities in the country to espouse compressed natural gas, CNG, for its entire fleet of public vehicles and a large share of taxis and auto rickshaws that ply here. And that was to address the pollution that it was seeing from vehicular pollution back in the 90s, right, in the late 90s, and the change in the regulation happened. So, and it is implemented at a scale that is sort of unprecedented even by European standards, right? So in that sense, Delhi has recognized the problem and sort of addressed it at that point. But what happened is that the subsequent growth that is witnessed, primarily diesel vehicles and the rampant sort of, I guess the destruction of the natural habitat. So the Aravalli mountains that sort of surround Delhi have been degraded over time, right? So that has allowed for more dust to sort of really come in from the desert that Delhi sits right next to. And that has really added to the problem. Now, I don't think it's correct to attribute this to the last 5 years of the government that's currently in place. It's something that's accumulated over time. But the fact that different administrations sit at the center, at the state, and at the city level, right, does not really help either. Because then it's a bit of political jugglery where each party is blaming the other for inaction, and every time something goes well, they each try to take credit. When in reality, I think the meteorology is probably the one thing that's worked in favor of clearing the air at all.
Let's bring it back.
I think it's really a combination of the fact that there's not been a clear political master.
Let's bring it back, Lori Merlevita, if we can. I mean, Lori, you extensively researched China's coal consumption and carbon dioxide trends. Are there any similarities between the causes and effects of air pollution in India and China, and why the situation has become so dangerous in New Delhi?
India has seen rapidly rising coal consumption and oil consumption in the past decade, very similar to what China experienced up to early this decade. And that is definitely a part of why the problem has been so hard to solve. There has been progress on some sectors, but a lot of that gets offset by the rapid increase in coal consumption and oil consumption. What China has managed to do in the past 5 years is to bring down the levels of pollution significantly. And that happened by putting a stop to the increase in coal consumption and then achieving dramatic improvements in the pollution control technologies that are used in coal-fired power plants, factories, and so on. But it would be very hard to do this with the technology only if you have a 10% per year or 5% per year increase in the underlying use of dirty energy.
Faisal Parish in Bangkok, I mean, we're being told that one major factor causing the pollution in New Delhi is farmers in neighbouring states like Punjab and Haryana burning crop stubble to clear their fields. I understand you're an expert in this sort of thing. How big an issue is crop burning? And how do you then deal with farmers whose crops are pretty much their livelihood?
So we have a lot of experience in Southeast Asia with this. In fact, burning of land for preparation of agricultural land is one of the main sources of the large-scale transboundary haze we have in Southeast Asia that affects more than 6 or 7 countries, and sometimes the smoke cloud covers several million square kilometers. So it is a major economic, environment, and health impact in this region, and the government has been trying to address it on a range of fronts and making some success. They've identified which are the most critical areas of burning or what type of land create the largest amount of smoke contribution, and that is burning and degradation of peatland system. They're a wetland system which has a very high amount of organic material, and when the fires there create massive smoke clouds. And so basically the government has moved to ban the further development in these areas, working with the farmers, smallholders, large-scale companies, private sector to introduce best management practice. Zero burning practice has been practiced for the last 15, 20 years by large-scale plantations, and governments are really working to bring that down through initiatives and incentives to smallholders by giving incentives or financial and other incentives for haze-free villages that they call.
Let me just take the debate back to Lori Merlevita in Helsinki, because Karthik in New Delhi was talking about the government initiative of car rationing and driving cars with odd and even plates on different days. I mean, other countries like Mexico have used similar car rationing schemes. And we know that China brought in a scheme for the Olympics back in 2008 to reduce pollution in Beijing. And apparently they have the best air quality in a decade. What lessons do you think India can learn then from China's success at improving air quality in that sense?
The measures taken in the capitals, such as New Delhi and Beijing, are things that catch the most attention. But what China has really done well is addressing pollution from the entire region surrounding Beijing, up to hundreds of kilometers away. Beijing is surrounded by hundreds of steel plants. It's the region in the world that produces the most steel. So addressing that industrial sector has been by far the biggest challenge. And of course, addressing coal-fired power plants. New Delhi is in a very challenging position because it's a city surrounded by areas with tens of millions of people, with factories, with farming, households, all of those emissions, and it's very limited. The city is very limited in what it can do within its own boundaries. So, and in a way, talking about New Delhi smog or Delhi smog is a misnomer, because we're talking about a smog that extends hundreds of kilometers all the way from Punjab to West Bengal. And what we really need to see in India is action on that regional level, not just putting Delhi alone on the spot, because it's impossible for the city to solve this alone. Most of the pollution there is coming from outside the city.
All right, gentlemen, stay with us, if you will, because I want to broaden this out across the Asia region. 99 of the world's 100 most polluted cities are in Asia. That's according to a report last year by Air Visual and Greenpeace. It also found that half of the world's 50 most polluted cities are in India, 22 in China, and the rest in Pakistan and Bangladesh. In Indonesia, the problem's even worse. The capital, Jakarta, is now ranked as the most polluted city in Southeast Asia, followed by Vietnam's capital, Hanoi. Well, air pollution reached alarming levels in Southeast Asia, where a toxic haze blanketed large parts of Malaysia and Singapore. Farmers in Indonesia were blamed again for burning stubble to make way for new crops. And the World Health Organization estimates around 7 million people die each year from breathing polluted air. More than 90% in low and middle-income countries, mainly in Asia and in Africa. Let's just bring in back our guests here. Karthik Ganesan in New Delhi. So, I mean, these figures are eye-watering, aren't they? The World Health Organization estimates 7 million people die a year from breathing toxic air, 90% of those deaths in poverty-stricken areas of Asia, of Africa. Why is Asia as a region blighted so much by this? Quickly.
Right. I think even though the facts may suggest that 7 million people die across the world, and in fact 1.1 million of those are in India, if you walk down the streets of Delhi, or which is the most impacted, you will not find too many people actually aware of this. You will find that most people walk around without a mask. So we're not yet there where Beijing got to when it came to people's awareness and everybody wearing masks and walking around and sort of putting the government under siege when it comes to acting on this and improving their quality of lives. So that realization has not dawned on them. And I think that is the most fundamental part of being able to address this issue, because there has to be a public demand and an outcry saying that I want better quality air. And that's just not happened, because there are a host of issues that governments need to resolve. And we focused on infrastructure creation and jobs and economic growth, but and we've just basically let this by the wayside. And I think that's really where the fundamental problem is. And unlike the case of China and Southeast Asia, where where you've got these large sources that they sort of really need to tackle, in the case of Delhi and much of India, it's a combination of sources that really result in what we have. So Delhi does not see the kind of jams that a Jakarta would see, but and transport emissions aren't really sort of that big. It's a fourth or maybe a little under a fourth. Yeah. So I think that's also the big challenge, that it's really multitude of sources, which means that the responsibility of actually tackling air pollution is not just with one agency, but it's with multiple ones spread across. And in a democratic system, when you have so many people coming together to work on air pollution, it's not that easy to resolve, but it has to start with the public making a clear case for why air quality needs to be improved, and that needs to figure in the way they vote.
Laurie Merlevita, we'll come back to you in a second just to respond to what Karthik was saying there. But let me bring in back Faisal Parish, because you're an expert, Faisal, on fire and haze prevention. Yet every year, Indonesian farmers are blamed for causing this toxic haze that drifts across large parts of Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore. What impact does this have, and why can't these three governments prevent what is effectively an annual crisis?
I mean, it has been going on in various scales for the last 20, 25 years. The big problem that we have is that we have a special type of ecosystem called peatland ecosystem, a natural ecosystem which stores up to 10,000 tons of carbon per hectare.
Let's just pick this up with Laurie Merlevita. Laurie, I mean, you've specialised on the impact of air pollution across Asia. Can it be measured in health terms as well as in a cost to the economy?
Absolutely. We know from studies that have compared the life expectancy, the risk of many diseases for people living in cities with clean air and those with polluted air, that the risk of diseases like lung cancer, stroke, heart attack, and so on goes up in polluted air. In fact, the entire global life expectancy is shortened by about 11 months because of air pollution. And of course, a disproportionate part of that takes place in the most polluted places, most of which are in Asia. So it is a major public health issue and an economic issue.
Faisal, let me ask you here, because, I mean, just reading through some of these pollution reports, they seem to be saying that there's a clear link between factors like poverty, low income, population growth that dictates toxic levels of air pollution. So is this all about where you are on the economic scale that decides the quality of the air that you breathe?
I mean, it's not just that where you are. I mean, it's also where you are physically in relation to the high fire-prone areas, which are in the region, and in the prevalent wind direction, whether you're downstream of these major fire-prone areas. It's also driven a lot by also larger scale, not just small-scale burning, but large-scale burning related to fires spreading into plantation and forest land, which the government is really struggling in this region in Southeast Asia to deal with, and it's a bigger issue across the Indian subcontinent. And this is where we need a much broader, innovative approach to bring in new incentives to address and prevent large-scale burning and give proper incentives for good land management practices and reward measures which prevent the use of fire and encourage long-term crop development without fire.
Karthik Ganesan in New Delhi, I mean, it's not just about vehicle emissions, is it? I mean, the World Health Organization says 3 billion people, that's 40% of the world's population, still don't have access to clean cooking fuels and technologies. And that's, of course, the main source of household pollution.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great point that you make. And I think there have been a bunch of studies that have basically said that 30% of all ambient particulate matter pollution that comes out, right, is actually coming from households burning biomass. And that is indeed something that we can't escape from. But this government has done a fantastic job in India with the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, where they've basically gone ahead and given a free LPG connection for the people who can't afford it below the poverty line. And for others, you know, at a very subsidized rate. So sort of enticing them to move away from the use of biomass in cooking and moving to LPG, which is liquefied petroleum gas, which is bottled and given to households. And that definitely will improve the experience of women and children in these households for sure. And at the end of the day, will also contribute to improving air quality in the ambient. But that is sort of like a long-term strategy in the sense that people need to sort of start seeing the value. But at the end of the day, it's a commodity that they're going to be paying something for. Firewood in many parts of the country is still free. Some people do spend on it, but they don't quite realize that the trade-off in terms of spending that money on LPG can have positive impacts for their health. And at the end of the day, can also end up saving them some money because, they're not falling sick so often. And the fact that, the entire family is healthier. So that transition will have to happen slowly.
OK, Faisal Parish in Bangkok, a final thought from you. Given the scale of India's air pollution, can it be fixed or is it too little too late, do you think?
Definitely these things can be fixed, but it needs political will. It needs a broad-based approach. And it needs not just focusing on the vehicles in the city, but in the large-scale agricultural development around, giving real incentives to farmers for maybe changing crop types or changing approaches, supporting mechanization and other incentives to reduce this annual large-scale burning, which is actually not good not only for health, but it's bad for the agricultural land. It decreases the productivity. If you burn it, better you keep the organic material and improve the productivity in situ.
Lori Merli-Vita in Helsinki, can Asian governments turn this around, do you think? A, do they have the financial clout? And B, do you think they have the political will to radically reduce air pollution?
Well, we've seen across the world in Beijing, and I would say Delhi, many other Asian capitals, is that when the middle class grows, when people start to worry more about their health, the concern about air pollution goes up and the political pressure goes up. I definitely expect to see governments across Asia taking more action. One thing that has improved in India is the level of data and access to data. So we can now track progress and point out where progress is happening and where not. And I believe that data revolution is also going to speed things up.
All right, gentlemen, it's a fascinating debate, but time is against us. We have to leave it there. Thanks to all our guests, Karthik Ganesan in New Delhi, Lori Merli-Vita in Helsinki, and Faisal Parish in Bangkok. Thank you all. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Darren, Jordon, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.